All right, it's 12 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday to you. Made it through another week. I think we've got about, I guess it's 4 more weeks until Thanksgiving break. So we're getting through it. Slow but steady. Wins the race. So today we're going to wrap up our study of Judaism. This is the 5th and final lecture. And at the end of the lecture today, you're going to have a homework assignment. It's an online assignment. It's labeled as Judaism HW, as in homework, on the Moodle class website. And this assignment is designed just to review some core ideas about Judaism before we begin to study Christianity on Monday, right? We have another 5 lectures on Christianity before we'll get to the 4th exam. So I'm giving you this extra assignment on Judaism just to reinforce some of what we've learned thus far before we move on to a new religious tradition. So by all means, pull up the lecture slides and look at them as you answer the questions, but it is due by the start of class on Monday. Right? So this class starts at 12, so it is due by 12 noon on Monday. Don't forget to do that assignment. So in my last lecture, we discussed the Jewish diaspora, the dispersal, the migration of Jews throughout initially the Middle East and Mediterranean world. But then with time, we'll see Jewish communities move even further to places like eventually the United States of America once we get to the modern period. And we'll be talking about Judaism in America in today's lecture. But when we talked about the Jewish communities that developed around the Mediterranean, we talked about 2 main geographical cultural groups. I told you about the Ashkenazim, that Ashkenazi Jews are those who settled in Europe, that is Europe with the exclusion of Spain and Turkey, right? The rest of Europe, Christian Europe. And then I told you about the Sephardic Jews, the Sephardim, who initially were in Muslim Spain, but of course Islam disappears from Spain and that community becomes centered in North Africa. And there's technically a different branch of the Jewish diaspora east of Egypt. That's the Mizrahi Jews, and you have the Yemenites down in Yemen. You can go further and you get the Ethiopian Jews. I grouped all of those factions into the Sephardic Jews. That is, Jews who lived under Muslim rule. So today, we're going to be talking about the Ashkenazim. We're going to be talking about the impact that this new culture of modernity that developed in Western Europe had on Europe's Jewish community, on the Ashkenazi Jews, and then by extension, the impact of those changes on American Judaism, and we'll conclude with our study of the creation of a new Jewish state, the idea of which developed among the Ashkenazi community, the state today known as Israel. So we'll be exploring all those different topics today. I gave this lecture at 11 a.m. for another class in another building, and I went over, really had to run over here because there's just so much to talk about these things. So whatever I don't get to at the end of the class today, please review those slides on your own, okay? So let's go ahead and dive in. We've talked before about this period in European history known as the European Enlightenment, that occurred in the 18th century. And this occurred in the wake of a number of religious wars throughout Europe. We've already had the Protestant Reformation, so the 17th century was dominated by wars between Catholics and Protestants. To the east, you also have the Orthodox and the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire involved as well. So in the 18th century, there's this paradigm shift. This shift towards a new social order based on reason and science, and the separation of politics from religion, the emergence of secularism. And with that, we also begin to see the emergence of nationalism. This idea that human beings belong to distinctive nations based on a shared culture, which may include religion, shared language, a shared understanding of history. And as old empires begin to fade out of the way, that each nation is entitled to its own state. So we begin to see in the modern era the emergence of the nation state. This idea that everyone within a particular state is French or German or Irish, and everyone within that state has the same rights as a citizen, regardless as to their religious beliefs. Now, different states, there's some variation there, but by and large, that's the thinking behind it. So as these new notions of nationalism and new states are emerging in the post-Enlightenment period, and this new understanding of the social order emerges, these ideas in Europe are finding their way to Ashkenazi Jews in Europe. Now, for some, they're not interested in that. Right? The only knowledge they care about is the knowledge of the Torah, the Talmud. This is sort of the approach of the Hasidim, right? We learned about Hasidic Jews last time, that their approach was to remain insular, cut off from the rest of society. But for other Jews, they were very much interested in engaging in the societies in the world around them, engaging in the latest scientific discoveries, in the latest philosophical ideas, the latest political theories, the latest academic studies of religion, for example. And they began to try and think about how to continue being Jewish in this new age, in this new post-Enlightenment age. And so this becomes a movement called the Haskalah, sometimes described as the Jewish Enlightenment, where Jewish thinkers are now grappling with the earlier ideas of the European Enlightenment and rethinking what it means to be Jewish in modern times. For example, should Jews in Europe assimilate and just become part of the broader culture? Right? The promise of nationalism was that it shouldn't matter whether you have religious views, whether you're Catholic or Jewish in modern post-Enlightenment France, you're all French. So should Jews then, just start using French as their first language, give up Yiddish and dress like everyone else, go to the same schools, get, the modern education curriculum and just completely assimilate? Or should they strive to continue their distinctive identity apart from the rest of society? Different members of the Ashkenazi community took different approaches. And so it's out of these debates and discussions that we see the emergence of three main modern branches of Judaism. The first is Reform Judaism, the second, Conservative Judaism, and the third is Orthodox Judaism. Now, this is a little bit of an oversimplification. There are some other factions, but these are the three main groups. And I've noted one of the nuances with regard to the Orthodox branch, that in time, there would even be another reform movement within Orthodoxy. And so we can talk about both modern Orthodox and traditional or Haredi Orthodox. The Hasidim, who we learned about last time, would conform to the Haredi, what's sometimes called ultra-Orthodox approach to Judaism. So I want to look at these three branches of modern Judaism individually now. Let's begin by looking at Reform Judaism. So Reform Judaism emerges among the Ashkenazi Jews who believed that Jews in this modern age should adapt and assimilate to the broader culture and society around them. And that meant making lots of changes to traditional Judaism. That meant, for example, embracing secular learning alongside traditional Jewish learning. That would mean, for example, engaging the ideas present in the writings of Charles Darwin, along with studying the book of Genesis in the Torah, right? Of not cutting yourself off from any modern knowledge. That also meant changing some practices, such as in worship services that took place in a synagogue, traditionally you would use Hebrew during the liturgy. The prayers would be in Hebrew, the language of the Torah. But Reform Jews began to use the vernacular meaning the language spoken by the people in the country in which they lived. So the vernacular language in the United States, generally speaking, is English. If you're a Jewish woman living in France, the vernacular is French. So suddenly, Reform Jews began to use French or English or German or Polish in worship services. They also incorporated the types of music that were found elsewhere in society. So we see things like pipe organs being installed in Reform synagogues, something that you would have found in churches at the time. And the worship services are shortened to make them more convenient and appropriate for the hustle and bustle of modern life. In modern times, we begin to see people challenging tradition, right? We've talked about that before when doing a lecture on religion and modernity, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism. And again, we've seen people grappling with patriarchy, about the way in which women are discriminated against in various aspects of life and society. So we see Reform Jews grappling with those same types of inequalities in Judaism, and they begin to make some changes. So for example, in a Reform synagogue, men and women are no longer separated. So in a traditional synagogue, you would have some kind of barrier, the mechitza, a screen, a curtain, or a separate balcony where the women would sit apart from the men. Reform synagogue, everyone sits together. So husbands and wives, everyone can sit together. They also, in the late 20th century, are the first to begin to ordain women as rabbis, as the scholars of the Talmud who formulate Jewish law, halakha. That begins in 1972. So Reform Judaism has its roots in the 19th century, and it takes until 1972 for women to begin to be ordained. They also introduced this ritual ceremony of a bat mitzvah. Now, traditionally, when a Jewish boy becomes 13 years old, he's recognized by the rabbis, according to Jewish law, as an adult. And when you're an adult, that means that you now have to observe the commandments, the mitzvot. And so it becomes a bar mitzvah, which means son of the commandment. And part of that ceremony involved reading a portion of the Torah in Hebrew before the community. Now, that ritual ceremony wasn't a part of a Jewish girl's life. According to traditional Judaism, when a girl becomes 12 years old, she now has to live according to the commandments, but you didn't have the same type of ritual ceremony for girls. Reform Judaism says, well, that's not fair. So they introduced the same ritual for girls, a bat mitzvah ceremony, daughter of the commandment. And they pushed the girl's age of adulthood to 13. So now it's 13 for both boys and girls, whereas traditionally it was 12 for girls and 13 for boys. Now this practice has become so popular that even Orthodox Jews, the traditional Jews, have in some cases observed it, but it's not part of the denomination per se. So how do you justify making all these changes, all these adaptations? Religion makes tradition sacred. That something is laid down because it comes from God, or it comes from the enlightened being, the Buddha or something like that, or the ancestors. And so you can't just change it, right? Well, they arrived at a new understanding of the Jewish scriptures. In light of modern academic analysis of texts, learning how texts came to be, who wrote them, when, were there outside influences on the content of the text, Reform Jews arrived at this new understanding of the Hebrew Bible as a repository of sacred traditions, as part of the Jewish heritage, but not word for word, divine revelation from the Creator that is binding on all times and all people. So they were very much open to academic critical analysis of the text. The text is still important as this repository of Jewish tradition spanning centuries, still a part of the community, but the meaning, the principles of the text were more important than the letter of the law. So Reform Jews, for example, would talk about the importance of justice in the Torah rather than worrying about a specific punishment for a specific crime, like stoning an adulterer, for example, something like that. Those types of things reflect their own time, their own circumstances, and they don't apply to Jews living in 20th century Europe or 21st century America, for example. So that being said, Reform Jews also did away with things like dietary law. He said that dietary law reflects, the ancient Israelites or ancient Jews living in another time and another circumstance. In modern times, it doesn't matter whether or not we mix meat and dairy, or we don't slaughter a cow a particular way. They did the same thing with purity laws, such as the use of mikvahs. All those practices go out of the way. Now, on an individual level, if you as an individual want to keep kashrut, want to go to the mikvah, want to practice those traditional elements of Judaism, you're free to do so. It's just the position that in Reform Judaism, it's not obligatory upon you. It's not considered to be a sin if you eat a food that isn't kosher, for example. Right? So it's very common for Reform Jews not to adhere to all those traditional rules, not only dietary law and purity laws, but also things like how you dress, right? Whether or not you cover your head, all types of things, that all that becomes a kind of individual option rather than something that you're expected to do. So where did this form of Judaism thrive and become popular? Well, Reform Judaism is the biggest Jewish denomination in the United States. The United States is the center of Reform Judaism. Later on in the lecture, we'll talk about the state of Israel. And in Israel, Orthodox Judaism is dominant and Reform Judaism is very small. So by and large, American Judaism is much more liberal and progressive than Judaism in the state of Israel. Here we see some images reflecting some of the changes brought about in modern Judaism. So over here on the left, we see a Jewish girl who is reading her Torah portion for her bat mitzvah. Okay, so she's now being recognized as an adult member of the community, and thus the expectation is that now she would be responsible for her own sins and going to services and things like that. She is a responsible adult in the eyes of God. Over here, we see a female rabbi, and she's holding the Torah scrolls she's taken from the ark here in the wall that would face Jerusalem. So not everyone was on board with these changes brought about by the Reform movement. And these defenders of the old way of doing things, of traditional Judaism, come to be known as Orthodox Judaism. So Orthodox Judaism is traditional Judaism. It's the way Judaism was before these modernizers came about in the modern period and started making all these changes. But it's actually not necessary to call them Orthodox Judaism until you have Reform Judaism, right? So if you're looking at Judaism in like the 16th century, you don't really talk about the existence of Orthodox Judaism because it's just Judaism. But once you have a Reform movement that's changed all these things, then you have to identify the traditional form. That becomes Orthodox Judaism. So Orthodoxy rejects all these modernization plans and changes. They continue to adhere to the laws of the Talmud as laid down by the rabbis over the centuries. So using classical Hebrew in worship services, maintaining the dietary laws and the purity laws and the rules about how you dress and how you live and all those types of things are an integral part of Orthodox Judaism. That the Torah is still understood to be the literal word of God, of Hashem, revealed to the prophet Moses at Sinai, and it is binding on the Jews in all times, in all places. Men alone can be rabbis, so they reject the ordination of women. There have been some efforts, particularly in modern Orthodoxy, to begin to ordain women as rabbis in Orthodoxy, but it hasn't really gotten going. So it's basically only men can be rabbis in Orthodoxy. In an Orthodox synagogue, you still have the separation of the genders. So here we see an Orthodox synagogue. We have a separate balcony area for the women apart from the men. Only boys can have a bar mitzvah, and that boys are adults at 13 and girls are still adults at 12. So the bat mitzvah has become so popular, especially in countries like the United States, where even families who come from the Orthodox tradition have even in some cases, as a family, as individuals, chosen to do a bat mitzvah. But it's not officially part of Orthodoxy. Men and women are still expected to cover their heads, right? Men wearing a kippah or yarmulke, women still wearing a tishel or a shadel, covering their hair that only their husbands can see. And still you have the strict observance of Shabbos or the Sabbath day, where you're expected to abstain from any type of work, right? All those rules and regulations apply. In Reform Judaism, that's not in play anymore. And in fact, at one time, some Reform members tried moving the Sabbath to Sunday. Since Christians go to church on Sunday, they decided that in the spirit of adapting and assimilating to the broader culture, if we're living in France or Germany or Britain or the United States, well, then why don't we also go to our services on Sunday instead of Saturday morning? That reform didn't take. They experimented with it, it didn't take. So the Sabbath is still Saturday, at least during the daylight hours in Reform Judaism, but they did toy with the idea of moving it to Sunday. So here we can see some images of the interior of an Orthodox synagogue, and we see the barriers for the different genders in place here. So this is the mechitza, this is the screen. The women sit in this section, and then the men on the other side in the front. And then here we see a balcony with curtains. So this is where the women would sit, and the men down here with the ark and the bima on the ground floor. So we have these two camps, right? We've got Reform Judaism. It's all about modernizing and assimilating and adapting, liberal, progressive. And then you have the traditional way of doing things, that's Orthodox Judaism. Then there emerges a middle ground between the two. A camp that says, you know what, we like the idea of making Judaism relevant to modern times and making some changes, but we think Reform Judaism has gone too far. They were too zealous to assimilate and adapt instead of being judicious and cautious and sort of gradually analyzing and making some changes. So that camp comes to be known as conservative Judaism. Now, even though it's called conservative Judaism, it's not actually the most conservative. That would be Orthodox Judaism. So conservative Judaism is the middle ground, this balance between Reform Judaism and Orthodoxy. So members of the conservative movement, they're okay with some reforms, some changes, but they really believe that those changes have to be made judiciously, with time, gradual debate, scholarly analysis, that you shouldn't make those changes just because, well, this is what everyone else is doing, so let's try and adapt to the way of doing things. Instead, it really needs to be done through careful analysis of the rabbinic tradition and of the sacred text. And so changes, reforms have been made within conservative Judaism, but much more gradually. So Hebrew is still often used for conservative services instead of the vernacular. The belief is that while the Hebrew Bible may not be the literal word of God in every sense, it is still inspired by God to the prophets and still retains a sanctity that reformers were more quick to abandon. They initially opposed ordaining women as rabbis, but after Reform Judaism began to do so in 1972, conservative Judaism, which is also centered in the United States, began to follow suit and ordained its first women as rabbis in 1985. So today you have female rabbis in modern Judaism, in Reform Judaism, in conservative Judaism, but not in Orthodox Judaism. And Orthodoxy would also include, for example, the Hasidim that we learned about last time. In Hasidic Judaism, it's only men as well. Hasidim are a mystical subsect of Orthodoxy. Yes?
What do you think that, like, a Christian kind of, I'm trying to find a word, like a Christian equivalent would be to, like, the conservative Judaism versus Orthodox Judaism?
That's a good question.
Like a Christian sect that, like, analyzes the Bible more academically.
So I can give you an example from my own family background. So I was raised a Lutheran, so one of the major branches of traditional Protestantism. And there are different, what's called synods or denominations of Lutheranism. One is the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is much more progressive. So for example, they ordain women as ministers and even bishops and are open to academic analysis of the New Testament. And then another American denomination is Missouri Synod. My brother is a part of that. And he believes the Bible is the literal word of God. Everything it says is absolutely literally true, and women cannot be ordained as ministers. So they're both Lutherans, both branch of Protestantism, but they have very different understandings of the New Testament, and thus that dictates their different practices as well.
Even like wearing clothes that have two different fabrics in them?
With regard to Judaism, I don't know that there's a Christian equivalent on those things. You know, in Christianity, there's always been a greater emphasis on what you believe rather than what you do, right? There's not as much focus on the law. And you can find this right in the writings of Paul. You know, Paul talks about being under grace and not the law. So I suppose maybe a better example with regard to practice might be something like the Mennonites. You know, Mennonites versus another Protestant like a Lutheran. There's obviously some very different practices there in terms of dress, right? You look at the way women dress in the Mennonite tradition versus how women in the Lutheran church dress. There's some significant differences as well. So I suppose that could be a kind of parallel to these changes. So this is JTS. This is the Jewish Theological Seminary. And this is the foremost center of conservative Judaism. It originated in the 19th century as an Orthodox institution, a place designed to maintain Jewish tradition in response to the changes brought about by the Reform movement, but it transforms into the citadel of conservative Judaism. And if you want to become a rabbi in the conservative denomination of Judaism, this is the place that you go. It's located in New York City. And the greater New York City metropolitan area has the greatest concentration of Jews in the United States. So major important centers of Jewish thought are located in the New York City area. So that's a nice segue to talk about Judaism in America. Today, we have the second largest Jewish community in the world, about 5 million. Estimates can vary. And Jewish identity, as I've mentioned before, is quite complex, that people can identify as Jewish on the basis of their ancestry, or they can identify as Jewish in the sense that they practice the religion of Judaism. They go to synagogue and they pray to Hashem and so forth. So the American Jewish community consists of both. There is a rabbinic tradition that if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish, even if you don't practice the religion. And so that raises some interesting questions about, well, who is Jewish and who's not Jewish? It all kind of depends on whether you identify as Jewish or not. The American Jewish community is overwhelmingly of Ashkenazi origin. So we know that that means that they are from a European country: Poland, Germany, France, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. But we have American Jews of Sephardic origin, Yemenite, Ethiopian, Mizrahi as well. Today, as I said, the area around New York City has the largest concentration of Jews. But just a nice little local footnote, way back in the year 1800, in the infancy of our republic, the state of South Carolina had the largest Jewish population in the United States of America. Now, admittedly, it was a small community, but based on the rest of the United States at that time, way back in the year 1800, South Carolina had the largest, centered around Charleston, and most of the Jews in South Carolina at that time were actually of Sephardic rather than Ashkenazi origin. Now, today, South Carolina does not have a large Jewish population. There are Jews, of course. In the Myrtle Beach area alone, we have about 4 or 5 synagogues, some conservative. There's the Chabad we looked at last time, the Hasidic Institute. There's even a community of what's called Messianic Jews. This is a form of Judaism where they incorporate Christian theology into their belief system and believe that Jesus was the awaited Messiah, but they still practice Judaism rather than Christianity. So that community is even present here as well. In addition to JTS, we also have Hebrew Union College, which is the foremost center of Reform Judaism. So if you want to train to be a conservative rabbi, go to JTS. If you want to be a Reform rabbi, go to Hebrew Union College. It was originally established in Cincinnati. And you say, why Cincinnati out in Ohio? Well, because back in the 19th century, Ohio was the western frontier. Right? You move beyond that, then you're starting to get into like the Dakota territories and unincorporated areas and things like that. So back then, land was much more affordable and accessible for people. But since its creation in Ohio, a sister campus is open in New York City. And so you don't have to go to Ohio. You can go to New York City to train as a Reform rabbi as well. American Jews have made enormous contributions to our history, our culture. Here's just one example. This is the cover of Time magazine back from like 1999 or 2000. And these are the presidential and vice presidential candidates for the Democratic Party ticket running against George W. Bush and Dick Cheney at the time. And these guys lost. But Joseph Lieberman, senator from Connecticut, comes from a modern Orthodox family. And had they won, he would have been the first Jewish vice president in American history. And so this is just an example of the prosperity that American Jews have enjoyed here in the United States, which is not to say that there haven't been horrific incidents of anti-Semitism. And there's still anti-Semitism, of course, in this country today. But the story of Jews in America is by and large one of prosperity. Including members of the Supreme Court as well, right? We recently lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She too is Jewish. And so Jews have become a hugely important part of American cultural history. And so even once we have the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, which will be our topic in just a moment, the United States remains this major center of Judaism, especially for Reform Judaism, conservative Judaism, and the population, as I said before, is still the second largest in the world. So on this map, we can see where we have the greatest concentration of Jews in the United States. You can see my home state of New York up here, and New Jersey have among the largest concentration. So in the Northeast, we have a large Jewish population, and then in states like Florida, a lot of New Yorkers relocated down there. Illinois with cities like Chicago, and then out on the West Coast, Nevada and California. And then you can see certain parts of the country, you really have very, very small Jewish populations. There's our state of South Carolina, not big there, but especially like up here in the upper Midwest, down here in the South, not a lot of Jews in those parts of the country. This is an interesting survey about how American Jews think about their identity and what it means to be Jewish in America. Over here, they did a survey talking about the different generations of American Jews and whether or not they think of themselves as Jewish on the basis of religion or Jewish on the basis of something else, their ancestry and so forth, right? That not in terms of religion. And if you go to the older generation, 93% are Jewish in terms of religion. But if you go to the millennials, those born after 1980, that number drops to 68% and 32% not being involved in the religion. You can see the same type of sentiment expressed here, where they're asked about being Jewish is mainly a matter of, they could choose ancestry or culture, religion, or a combination of the two. And in total, we have that 62% of those surveyed believe that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry and culture, right? That it wasn't based on your practice of the religion of Judaism. Those who said it was mainly religious, that's 15%, and the other group which said it was a combination of the two is 23%. So that gives us a sense of the complexity of Jewish identity, right? That it's not just a religious identifier, that according to a majority in this poll, it's actually mostly about your ancestry and culture rather than whether or not you go to synagogue and believe in God and those types of things. Here we have a denominational breakdown of the American Jewish community. You can see that Reform Judaism is the biggest. 35% of American Jews surveyed identified with Reform Judaism. Then you have Conservative Judaism at 18%, and then Orthodox Judaism at only 10%. Now, there are some other branches of modern Judaism that we just don't have time to go through. They would fall into the 6% camp. And then look at the other big section here. Those are people who don't identify with any of them. Identify with any particular denomination. So Reform Judaism is the biggest in the United States, followed by no denomination, and then comes Conservative Judaism. If we were to look at a similar survey of Israel, we would find Orthodoxy being the biggest. So let's talk about Israel. So if we go back to the post-Enlightenment period, go back to the 19th century, this time of transformation in Europe, where we're seeing the end of the old empires and old monarchies and the transition to nation states that employ democratic systems, right, parliamentary democracies and so forth. We begin to see people thinking about being members of particular nations and having nation states, that we should have a state if we are a distinctive people apart from other peoples. And building off of Enlightenment ideas, these nation states, it depends on the country, but generally speaking, are of a secular nature, right? One in which religion plays a more important role in private life rather than in public life. And Ashkenazi Jews, Jews in Europe, are also engaging in these same ideas. Now, for some, they saw this as a basis to promote assimilation, right? That if I'm a Jewish family in France, then in the modern age, we're going to go to the French schools like everyone else, and we're going to speak French, and we're going to dress like everyone else, and we're going to eat like everyone else, and we're going to be a part of this greater society, and hopefully we'll be treated as equals. Right? That the promise is that if you're a citizen of France or a citizen of the United States, then you are guaranteed the same rights, same protections as everyone else. And it doesn't matter whether if I'm Catholic or Lutheran or Jewish, we'll be equals. That was the hope and the promise. But the reality was much more complicated. And so the story of the creation of the State of Israel begins with this Ashkenazi, largely secular Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl. So Herzl was a journalist, a reporter, and coming from a secular family, a segment of the Jewish community that believed in assimilating, becoming part of these nation states in post-Enlightenment Europe, he was part of those who hoped that there was a future for Jews in Europe. But he became disenchanted. And one of the events that really shaped his views was what's called the Dreyfus Affair. In France, there was a court case where a French military officer who was Jewish was being put on trial for treason. And to the outside observers, it seemed obvious that this man was innocent, that the known evidence all indicated he was innocent. However, the court found him guilty nonetheless. And the conclusion of many observers, including Theodor Herzl, was that he was found guilty because he was Jewish, that this was a blatant example of anti-Semitism occurring even in a country that had now become, right, modern, this nation state, these ideas of equality for everyone, that anti-Semitism was still a problem. So Herzl comes to develop this political ideology known as Zionism. Zionism, to put it concisely, is Jewish nationalism. This idea that Jews are a distinctive people apart from everyone else, and that they should have their own nation state. So just like the Germans have their state and the French have their state, that the Jews, even though right in the diaspora period, they're scattered in all these different countries, that they're actually one people and that they should have their own state as well. So this idea of Zionism is in its origin a secular political project. Herzl's idea wasn't, oh, we're going to restore the kingdom of Israel and take a descendant of King David and create the monarchy and have a theocratic system where the laws of the Torah are implemented by the state. No, as this modern European Jewish thinker, he sees this state as a state like a European country, a secular state for Jews, but not a Jewish theocratic state. And he sees it as being a parliamentary democracy, very much like a European modern state. But it's one in which the Jews would have their own government, their own military, so that they would never be a vulnerable minority in another country again, right? That so long as they continue to be a minority in France, in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, they'll never be safe from anti-Semitism. So the only solution, he says, is that they should have their own state, where they're the majority, and they can have their own government to protect them, their own military. And so it's that political ideology that will eventually give rise to the creation of a new state in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, called Israel. But he doesn't live to see it. He dies in 1904 before that can happen. Now, initially, people who we know as Zionists, the people who adopted this political ideology, were thinking about different places in the world where this state could exist. Should it be in Europe? Should it be in another place that the various colonial powers at the time were colonizing, maybe like Madagascar or South America? The choice in the end was what seems now to be an obvious one, but the choice in the end was Palestine. So Palestine is where the kingdom of Israel had been, the kingdom of Judah. It's where Jerusalem is. So it's of obvious importance to Jews, no matter where they live in the world. But at the time, Palestine was already inhabited. It's inhabited by hundreds of thousands of Arabic-speaking Christians and Muslims, and some Jews as well, but it was mostly Muslims and then a large Christian minority. And the people living there had also been influenced by this new idea of nationalism, and they had begun to think of themselves as a distinctive people as well. People we know today as the Palestinians. Now that land, before it was conquered by the British during World War I, had been part of the Muslim Ottoman Empire for centuries, going back to 1517. And before that, it was under the rule of various other Muslim dynasties going all the way back to the 7th century. Before the 7th century, it was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Christian Byzantine Empire. And then if you keep going back, right, we talked about the various empires that conquered Judea in an earlier lecture. Then we can finally get to the existence of the kingdom of Judah, and before that, the kingdom of Israel. So the Zionists, after Herzl, began to focus on what was now the British Mandate of Palestine, as they took it from the Ottomans, as a perfect opportunity to begin migrating there in order to one day establish this Jewish state. Now, the early Zionists were secular. They came from those influenced by modern culture. And so there was actually religious opposition among rabbis to Zionism early on. They didn't like the fact that people like Herzl had been secular. These guys weren't keeping the commandments, right? They weren't observant Jews. And some rabbis also felt that the diaspora would only end when the Mashiach, when the Messiah comes. When the Messiah comes, the diaspora will end, and all of God's chosen people will return to the promised land, and then the kingdom of Israel will be restored. And until then, for the secular political activists to force God's hand, that's like blasphemous. So there's religious opposition to Zionism, but in time, religious support for Zionism would grow. And you see different types of Zionism, some secular in origin, others overtly religious in nature. Here we see Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. And this is the copy of his manifesto for the establishment of the Jewish state. It's called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And so he lays out his vision of a future Jewish state and why it's necessary for Jews to have their own state. So immigration to the British Mandate has begun, but there's still opposition and some hesitation. Tragically, one of the events that really accelerates and builds support for Zionism is, we talked about this a little bit last time, the outbreak of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So the Nazi regime that comes to power in Germany and then succeeds in conquering neighboring countries like Poland, they are white supremacists who believe that Jews should be exterminated from European society. And so they arrest and round up Jews wherever they find them in Europe and place them in death camps. And in this map, wherever we see the Nazi flag, this is the location of a death camp. Places like Dachau and Auschwitz. And the result, in a relatively short span of time, is the systematic murder of 6 million Jews in Europe. Overwhelmingly in Europe. The Nazis do get into North Africa and take some Sephardic Jews as well, but overwhelmingly it's the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And in the aftermath of the Holocaust, 60% of the Ashkenazi community has died, 60%. So out of this horror, you can understand why some would now really throw their support behind Zionism. This idea that, look, even in the modern era of secularism, of nationalism, of equal rights, we're still being hunted down and murdered. We will only be safe if we have our own country. And so support really, really swings behind the creation of the State of Israel. And it comes into existence in what was previously the British Mandate of Palestine in 1948. Now, this was a very messy process. This wasn't something that was just like, yay, we create Israel, because, of course, this land was already inhabited. So you have an existing population of Arabic-speaking Muslims and Christians and some Jews. And then you have all these Jewish immigrants initially from Europe coming in and then arriving, not with the idea of, hey, we want to live side by side with you guys. They come in saying, we want to create our own state here, where we're the majority and we rule and we have our own government and military. So conflict breaks out. We have competing visions for the future of this relatively small plot of land. One side wanting to see an Arab state, a state of Palestine. The other side wanting to see the creation of a Jewish state, the state of Israel. So the United Nations tries to step in. And they decide that the only solution is to partition, right? We've talked about partition before when we talked about the partition of India. Partition Palestine into a Jewish state, the state of Israel, and an Arab state, the state of Palestine, roughly divided 50-50. But the issue was that at the time, the Zionist side, the number of Jews in Palestine was quite small. The overwhelming population was still the Arabs, the Palestinians. And so they saw the idea of giving up half their land under the dictates of this foreign international entity to be outrageous. They reject the partition plan and war breaks out. And the Palestinian Arabs have on their side neighboring Arab states like Syria and Egypt. But to the shock of the world, the Zionists, who would later become the Israelis, end up not only defending their land, but even taking more land in the process and establishing what becomes, as recognized by the international community, the State of Israel in 1948. And we have a Jewish state now in existence. And here you can see the cover of the British era Palestine Post announcing the creation of the State of Israel. So the creation of the State of Israel for Israelis, for Jews, is this momentous event, right? It's their independence, the creation, the founding of their country. For the Palestinians, this is a catastrophe. And they refer to this event as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Because when the State of Israel is created, 700,000 Arab refugees are also homeless. They lose their towns, their cities, where they and their families have lived for hundreds of years, and they live as refugees. And sadly, even today in the 21st century, there are still refugees and their descendants, which are even more numerous, living in refugee camps in various Middle Eastern countries. And the Palestinians still do not have a state. So the consequence of this event also has an impact on the Jews who are living in places in, for example, North Africa or in Iran. Because the Arab states like Egypt now start treating their own Jews, the Sephardic Jews, as enemies within, right? That they're Zionist sympathizers, and they're working for this new state of Israel against the Arabs. And so we see states like Egypt suddenly now arresting and persecuting their own Jewish populations. And cities like Cairo, which once had like 200,000 Jews, today the number of Jews in Cairo is like 100. And the synagogues are basically all in disuse. So then you have all the Sephardic Jews fleeing and migrating to Israel as well. And so even though Ashkenazi Jews were the architects of Israel, today, if you looked at the demographics of the state of Israel, the population is actually mostly Sephardic and Mizrahi, right, from the Middle Eastern region rather than of European origin, even though Herzl and the founders were Ashkenazi. So this shows us the development of the state of Israel. This is prior to the partition. The yellow territory is the Palestinian territory where the Arabs are the majority, and the orange is where the Jews are a majority, right? So they're a minority there. The United Nations partition plan looks like this. So the yellow territory would be Palestine, the orange territory would be Israel, and then Jerusalem, because it's sacred to so many different camps, right? The Christians throughout the world and the Muslims and the Jews, it was going to be an international zone, administered by an independent international body and not belonging to either state. The Palestinians, as I said, reject the partition plan. The war breaks out, the War of Independence for the Israelis, or the Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, and the Israelis are successful, and they take not only what was given to them in the partition plan, but even more. So this territory in orange is what, according to international community, international law, is the state of Israel today. In 1967, the Israelis go to war against Egypt and Syria, their Arab neighbors again, and when that occurs, they are once again victorious. This is called the Six-Day War because the Israelis win in 6 days. They defeat their neighbors. And so they take the Sinai from Egypt, the Gaza Strip, which had been taken by Egypt in the 47 war, the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, which is the old city of Jerusalem, from the Jordanians, and the Golan Heights from Syria. So suddenly the Israelis are controlling all of this. But the problem is, according to international law, you can't annex territory that you win in war. So for example, when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it would have been illegal under international law for us to suddenly declare Iraq was part of the United States, to claim that land as ours. So the Israelis would be violating international law to annex this land. They give this land back to Egypt in a peace treaty with Anwar Sadat later on. But this land still remains under Israeli control. And so when you hear people in the news talking about the occupied territories, they're talking about these lands which Israel got in the 67 war, which are still under Israeli military control. And the Palestinians still don't have a state, right? So if you're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, the ultimate authority in your land is not your own government, but the Israeli military. So the main police force there is Israeli military rule. Religiously, the significance of the Six-Day War is that once the West Bank is conquered by the Israelis, they have the old city of Jerusalem. And the old city of Jerusalem is where you find all the holy sites. So the holiest site in modern Judaism, what's called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, is now under Israeli control. And this wall is believed to be the sole remaining part of the Second Temple, the temple that was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So it is the holiest place on earth for Jews. That's what you face when you pray. So Jews will come and they will pray at the Western Wall. As I said before, Orthodox Judaism is dominant in Israel. So at the Western Wall, at a religious site like this, Orthodox protocols rule. So there is a mechitza, a separation of men and women. So men and women do not pray together at the Western Wall. They are separate. A woman's voice is also considered to be inappropriate to be heard aloud. So while men can pray aloud at this holy site, women are supposed to pray quietly. There are some reformers who come and they pray aloud, and then the police have to come, and there's all this stuff. So there are reform movements testing those rules, but Orthodoxy rules. There's a lot of interesting sort of folk customs around the Western Wall. One is to leave notes for God, prayers and so forth, in the cracks in the wall, and that's what you can see here. You can see some there. And then periodically, rabbinic authorities will come and clear them. I don't know what they do with them, whether they bury them or probably bury. If it has the word of God on it, then they would bury them. But that's a folk custom that people come and do. And here you can see how contentious this real estate is. So here's the Western Wall, the holiest site in modern Judaism. This is the Mechitza, this is the men's section and the women's section. And then right above it, you have this, which is called the Dome of the Rock, which is part of the Masjid al-Aqsa complex. This is a Muslim shrine. This is the third holiest site in Islam. So they're literally right on top of each other. And so this stretch of real estate is among the most contested, conflict-centered in the world today. All right, I am all out of time, so that concludes my lectures on Judaism. And again, you have the Judaism homework assignment on Moodle. Don't forget to do that. You get various questions about our study of Judaism thus far, and it's due by the start of class on Monday. All right, thank you very much. Have a good weekend.